"You're becoming a burden, Mom." Those were the words my son Daniel said to me on a rainy Thursday evening, standing in the kitchen of the house where I had raised him, bandaged his scraped knees, celebrated his graduations, and prayed for him through every hardship of his life. For a moment, I simply looked at him. The sound of the rain tapping against the window filled the silence between us. His wife, Ashley, stood near the counter holding a coffee mug with both hands. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. There was something in her expression that told me she had heard these words before tonight. Maybe she had even helped put them there. I lowered my eyes and folded the dish towel in my hands. "I see," I said quietly. Daniel let out a breath as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "We're just worried about you," he added. "You can't keep living like this forever." I nodded slowly. The funny thing was, I wasn't sure what he meant. I paid my own bills. I drove my own car. I lived alone and never asked him for money. I had spent the last 7 years since my husband Robert passed away learning how to do everything myself. If a pipe leaked, I called a plumber. If the lawn needed mowing, I hired someone. If I felt lonely, I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch with a book. I had never wanted to be a burden to anyone. Yet somehow, that was how my son saw me now. Or perhaps how someone wanted him to see me. Ashley finally spoke. "Maybe it's time to think about something smaller," she said gently. "A condo. Maybe a senior community." Her voice was sweet, but it felt rehearsed. Like a script she had practiced many times. I smiled politely. "I'll think about it," I replied. The conversation ended there. They seemed satisfied. Later that night, I drove home through the rain. The windshield wipers moved back and forth while memories drifted through my mind. Daniel at 8 years old, running across a little league field. Daniel at 17, opening his college acceptance letter with tears in his eyes. Daniel at 25, hugging me after his wedding and thanking me for everything I had done for him. Somewhere between those moments and tonight, something had changed. When I got home, the house was quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. I hung my coat by the door and walked through the familiar rooms. Every photograph on the walls told the story of a life spent loving my family. Yet for the first time, I wondered if they remembered that story at all. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. The rain continued outside. The clock continued ticking. And the words continued echoing in my mind. "You're becoming a burden." I should have been angry. I should have cried. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because deep down, I knew something Daniel didn't. There was a truth buried in our family's past. A truth so important that it had remained hidden for more than 30 years. And before long, that truth was going to change everything. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still dark, and for a few seconds I forgot about the conversation at Daniel's house. Then the memory returned, quiet and unwelcome, like a cold draft slipping through an old window. I got out of bed and made coffee the same way I had every morning for years. 2 spoonfuls of ground coffee. A splash of cream. The familiar routine settled my thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin layer of mist hung over the backyard, softening the outlines of the maple trees Robert had planted when Daniel was 10 years old. I carried my mug to the kitchen table and looked out the window. The yard needed trimming. The fence would probably need repainting before summer. There was always something to do. That was one of the reasons I never understood why anyone thought I could not manage my own life. After breakfast, I drove to the grocery store. The young cashier smiled and asked how my week was going. I smiled back and told her it was fine. It was easier than explaining the complicated truth. On the way home, I passed the elementary school Daniel had attended. Children were running across the playground while teachers stood nearby watching them. The sight pulled me backward through time. I could still picture Daniel carrying a backpack that looked too large for his small frame. I remembered packing his lunches, helping with science projects, sitting through school concerts, and working extra hours whenever money was tight. Robert and I had never been wealthy. We simply did whatever needed to be done. That afternoon, I decided to clean the attic. It was something I had postponed for months. Dust floated through beams of sunlight as I opened old boxes filled with photographs, holiday decorations, and school papers. Each box seemed to contain a different version of our family. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer vacations, smiling faces frozen in time. I found a photograph of Daniel standing beside his first car. He had been so proud that day. Robert had his arm around him, both of them grinning like boys. Looking at the picture, I felt a familiar ache. Not because Robert was gone. I had learned to live with that grief. The ache came from realizing how much of our family's history seemed invisible now. The sacrifices. The long nights. The difficult choices. So many things Daniel had never known. As the afternoon faded, I opened another dusty box tucked behind a stack of old blankets. Unlike the others, this one was sealed with yellowing tape. My name was written across the top in Robert's handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters made my heart skip. I carefully brushed away the dust and rested my hand on the lid. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. I had no memory of ever seeing this box before. Outside, the wind rattled the attic window. Inside, everything was silent. Then, with trembling fingers, I began peeling back the tape, completely unaware that what waited inside would force me to question everything I thought my son knew about our family's past. Inside the box were documents, neatly stacked and tied together with a faded blue ribbon. For a moment, I simply stared at them. Robert had always been organized, but he was also careful. If he had hidden something away, there had been a reason. I untied the ribbon and lifted the first bundle. On top was a letter addressed to me in his handwriting. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words were still clear. Margaret, if you are reading this, then enough time has passed that the truth can finally be known. My heart began to beat faster. I sat down on an old wooden trunk and continued reading. The letter took me back more than 30 years, to a time when Daniel was preparing to leave for college. Back then, he had been bright, ambitious, and full of dreams. He wanted to attend one of the best engineering programs in the state. The problem was that we could not afford it. Robert's small business had been struggling, and our savings had nearly disappeared after a difficult recession. As I read, memories I had not revisited in years slowly returned. I remembered the sleepless nights. The kitchen table covered in bills. The quiet conversations after Daniel had gone to bed. I remembered how excited he had been when his acceptance letter arrived. He had stood in the living room grinning from ear to ear while Robert and I congratulated him. What he never knew was what happened afterward. Beneath the letter was a copy of a property deed. My eyes widened the moment I recognized it. It was the deed to 20 acres of farmland that my father had left me before he passed away. The land had been in my family for generations. Growing up, I spent summers there chasing butterflies through open fields and helping my father repair fences. I had always imagined passing it down someday. Yet according to the documents in my hands, I had sold it only weeks before Daniel started college. I closed my eyes. The memory returned all at once. The buyer. The signatures. The drive home afterward when I cried quietly behind the steering wheel so Robert would not see. We had used every dollar from that sale to pay tuition, housing, books, and expenses. Daniel never knew because Robert and I agreed he should not carry that burden. We wanted him focused on building his future, not worrying about our sacrifices. My hands trembled as I continued sorting through the papers. There were tuition receipts, cancelled checks, bank records, and notes written by Robert documenting every payment. Then I found something that stopped me cold. Tucked inside another envelope was a letter from Robert addressed not to me, but to Daniel. The envelope had never been opened. Across the front, Robert had written a single instruction. Give this to Daniel only when he forgets where he came from." I stared at those words for a long time. Outside, the evening sun was beginning to fade. The attic had grown darker around me. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the hour. And for the first time since that painful dinner, I realized that the truth I had been carrying for decades was not only hidden from my son. It had been waiting patiently for the exact moment when he needed it most. I carried the unopened envelope downstairs and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. The kind of silence that makes every small sound seem louder. The hum of the refrigerator. The ticking of the clock. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I made a simple dinner but barely touched it. My thoughts kept returning to the letter Robert had left behind. For years, I had accepted that some sacrifices belonged in the past. They were not debts to collect. They were acts of love. That was how parents lived. We gave because we wanted our children to have opportunities we never had. We did not keep score. Yet as I sat there staring at the envelope, I could not ignore the feeling that something had shifted. Not because Daniel had hurt my feelings. Pain passes. What troubled me was how easily he had accepted a version of me that was not true. Somehow, over the years, the story of our family had been rewritten. I thought about recent conversations. The little comments Ashley often made. Questions about my finances. Suggestions that my house was too large. Remarks about retirement communities and simplifying my life. Individually they seemed harmless. Together they painted a picture. Slowly, almost invisibly, I had been transformed from a mother into a problem that needed solving. The realization settled heavily on my shoulders. The next afternoon Daniel called. His voice sounded distracted. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. There was a pause. Then he mentioned that Ashley had found information about a condominium development nearby. Smaller homes. Less maintenance. Easier living. I listened. Quietly. The words felt familiar now. Rehearsed. When he finished, I thanked him for his concern. He seemed surprised that I did not argue. After we hung up, I walked through my house room by room. The living room where Daniel opened Christmas presents as a child. The dining room where Robert and I hosted Thanksgiving dinners for decades. The hallway covered with family photographs. Every space held memories. Yet I noticed something else. None of these rooms represented dependence. They represented work. Effort. Sacrifice. Years of building a life one careful step at a time. That evening I returned to the envelope. The paper felt fragile beneath my fingers. For several minutes I simply held it. Then I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter dated more than 30 years earlier. Robert's words were steady and deliberate. He wrote about the farmland. The tuition payments. The difficult choices we made without complaint. Then his tone changed. "If you are reading this, son," he wrote, "it means you have forgotten something important. Success is not measured by what you own. It is measured by the people who helped you become the person you are." My eyes filled with tears. Not from sadness, but from hearing Robert's voice again after all these years. I continued reading. Near the end, one sentence stopped me completely. "There may come a day when you believe your mother needed you more than you needed her. If that day ever arrives, look at these records and remember the truth." I lowered the letter slowly. Outside, the sun disappeared below the horizon. The kitchen grew darker. And for the first time, I began to understand that the truth waiting inside that box was not only about the past. It was about a reckoning that was moving steadily toward all of us. For the next few days, I said nothing about the letters. Life continued on the surface exactly as it always had. I watered the flowers on the front porch. I stopped by the grocery store on Tuesday morning. I attended my weekly church group on Wednesday. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen an ordinary 72-year-old widow going about her routine. But inside, something had changed. I was paying attention. Late Friday afternoon, Daniel called again. This time his voice carried a sense of urgency. Ashley was planning a family dinner the following weekend, and they wanted me to come. The invitation sounded pleasant enough, yet something about it felt unusual. They rarely insisted on seeing me lately. After we ended the call, I sat in my living room and thought about it. The answer arrived the next morning. My neighbor Carol stopped by with a basket of zucchini from her garden. During our conversation, she casually mentioned seeing Ashley at a local real estate office earlier that week. The comment might have meant nothing, except Carol remembered hearing Ashley mention my address. I smiled politely and thanked her for the vegetables, but after she left, I sat quietly for a long time. A pattern was beginning to emerge. The conversations about smaller homes. The repeated suggestions about simplifying my life. The sudden family dinner. None of it felt accidental anymore. That evening, I opened the box again and reviewed every document carefully. The more I read, the clearer the story became. Robert had preserved everything. Receipts. Property records. Bank statements. Letters. He had documented not only what we sacrificed but why. More than once he wrote that Daniel deserved the freedom to build his future without carrying guilt about the cost. Reading those words filled me with both pride and sadness. We had protected our son so completely that he never understood how much had been given for him. On Sunday afternoon, I received another call. This time it was from Ashley herself. Her voice was warm and cheerful. She explained that the family dinner would be special. Several relatives would be attending. She hoped I would come with an open mind because everyone wanted what was best for me. The phrase lingered after the call ended. What was best for me? I had heard those words before. Often, they appeared just before someone tried making a decision on another person's behalf. Throughout the week, I prepared quietly. Not for an argument. Not for a confrontation. Simply for the possibility that certain truths might finally need to be spoken aloud. On Friday evening, I placed Robert's letter to Daniel into a manila envelope. Then I added copies of the property deed, the tuition records, and several of the documents Robert had carefully preserved. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Outside, the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, the house remained calm and still. By the time the family dinner arrived, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever conversation Ashley believed she was preparing for, it was not going to unfold the way she expected. The following Saturday, I arrived 10 minutes early. Ashley had always preferred guests to be punctual, and I saw no reason to change my habits now. Their house looked exactly as it always had. The flower beds were trimmed. The porch was spotless. Through the front window I could see warm lights and familiar faces moving through the dining room. When Ashley opened the door, her smile appeared bright and welcoming. Too bright. She hugged me lightly and guided me inside. Several relatives had already gathered. Daniel's cousin Michael was there with his wife. Ashley's parents sat near the living room fireplace. Everyone seemed relaxed, chatting over appetizers and coffee. I carried the manila envelope in my handbag and kept it close. Throughout the evening, I watched quietly. Ashley moved through the room with confidence, steering conversations from one topic to another. More than once, she mentioned how difficult it could be for older homeowners to maintain large properties. Each comment sounded casual, helpful, reasonable. Yet every remark seemed aimed in the same direction. Eventually everyone settled around the dining table. Plates were passed. Glasses clinked softly. For a while the conversation stayed harmless. Weather. Travel plans. Family updates. Then Ashley placed her fork down and looked toward me. The room gradually grew quieter. Margaret, she said gently, Daniel and I have been thinking about your future. We worry that your house may be becoming too much responsibility. Daniel nodded. He looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Ashley continued. There are wonderful communities nearby. Smaller homes. Less upkeep. More support. We only want what is best for you. Several relatives exchanged polite glances. No one seemed surprised. Suddenly I understood. This conversation had been planned long before I arrived. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. Ashley spoke for several more minutes. She discussed finances, maintenance costs, and long-term planning. Every argument sounded practical. Every sentence sounded thoughtful. When she finally stopped speaking, all eyes turned toward me. I took a slow breath. You have clearly given this a lot of thought, I said. Ashley smiled. We have. I nodded. Then perhaps it is time for everyone to hear a few things that have not been discussed. The smile on her face faltered slightly. I reached into my handbag and removed the envelope. Daniel frowned. Mom, what is that? I looked at him carefully. For a moment I saw not the man sitting across from me but the young boy who once believed his parents could solve any problem. Something your father wanted you to have, I replied. The room became very still. Even Ashley seemed uncertain now. I placed the envelope on the table between us. No anger filled my voice. No bitterness. Only calm. Because after carrying a truth for more than 3 decades, I no longer felt the need to defend myself. I simply needed the truth to speak for itself. Daniel slowly reached toward the envelope, completely unaware that the papers waiting inside were about to change the way he saw his entire life. Daniel looked down at the envelope and hesitated. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then he opened it. The first document he pulled out was the property deed. His eyes moved slowly across the page. I watched the confusion form on his face. He turned over another document. Then another. Tuition records. Payment receipts. Bank statements. The color gradually drained from his expression. What is all this? He asked quietly. Keep reading, I said. Nobody else spoke. Even Ashley remained unusually still. Daniel unfolded the handwritten letter from Robert. The moment he recognized his father's handwriting, his posture changed. He sat back in his chair and began reading carefully. As his eyes moved across the page, the confidence he had carried throughout the evening slowly disappeared. Several times he stopped and reread certain lines. Once he swallowed hard and looked toward me before lowering his gaze again. The room felt smaller somehow. More honest. More difficult. When he finally reached the last page, he placed the letter on the table and stared at it for several seconds. You sold the farmland? He asked. His voice sounded distant. I nodded. Yes. The land Grandpa left you? Yes. He blinked several times. To pay for college. I folded my hands calmly. Your father and I paid for your education together. The land made it possible. Daniel looked down again. Why did nobody tell me? The answer came easily because I had lived with it for decades. Because we wanted you focused on your future, not on our sacrifices. A heavy silence settled over the table. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ashley's father stared at the documents. Nobody seemed interested in discussing retirement communities anymore. Daniel picked up the letter again. His eyes stopped at one section and remained there. I knew exactly which sentence he was reading. There may come a day when you believe your mother needed you more than you needed her. If that day ever arrives, remember the truth. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at me. Not through me. Not around me. At me. The way he had when he was younger. The way a son looks at his mother before the world teaches him to overlook her. Mom. He began, then stopped. The word seemed heavier than usual. Ashley finally spoke. Nobody knew about any of this. Her voice sounded careful, measured. I turned toward her. Robert knew. I knew. That was enough. She looked away first. Daniel remained silent. I could almost see the years rearranging themselves in his mind. The assumptions. The stories. The conclusions he had accepted without questioning. None of them fit anymore. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip. My hands were steady. I felt no victory. No satisfaction. Only relief. After 30 years. The truth no longer belonged to a dusty box hidden in an attic. It was sitting openly on the table for everyone to see. And judging by the look in Daniel's eyes, its work had only just begun. No one reached for their food after that. The dinner that had begun with polite conversation now sat suspended in a strange silence. Daniel remained focused on the document spread across the table. Every few moments he picked up another page and studied it as if hoping the facts would somehow change. They did not. Numbers remained numbers. Dates remained dates. Signatures remained signatures. The truth was stubborn that way. It did not bend simply because someone wished it had arrived sooner. Ashley sat quietly beside him. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unsure of what to say. She glanced toward Daniel several times, but he never looked back. His attention remained fixed on the papers his father had left behind. Eventually he cleared his throat. "I thought I knew everything about how we got through those years," he said softly. "Dad always said the business recovered. He told me things worked out." I nodded. They did work out. He looked confused. "How can you say that?" A small smile touched my face. "Because you graduated. You built a career. You created a life for yourself. That was the outcome we wanted." He lowered his eyes again. Across the table, Michael quietly folded his hands. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve room to breathe. Daniel picked up one of the tuition receipts. "This payment alone was more than I earned during my first year after college," he said. "You paid all of this. Your father and I did. And you never told me." "No." His jaw tightened slightly. "Why?" I thought about that question before answering. "Because love is not a loan, Daniel. Parents are supposed to help their children move forward. We did not want you spending your life trying to repay us." The words settled over the room. I could see them reaching him in a way the documents never could. Facts explained what happened. Understanding required something deeper. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. He looked tired. Older somehow. Not because of age, but because certain illusions had finally fallen away. Then he asked the question I had been expecting all evening. "Did you know what Ashley and I were planning to talk about tonight?" Ashley shifted uncomfortably. I met my son's eyes. I had a feeling. He stared at the table. "And you still came?" "Of course I came." "Why?" This time my answer arrived immediately. "Because you are my son." Something flickered across his face. Regret. Gratitude. Sorrow. Perhaps all three. Outside the dining room window, the last traces of daylight disappeared. The glass reflected our faces back at us. A family sitting around a table. The same family as before. Yet somehow completely different. Daniel slowly gathered the papers into a neat stack. Then he placed his father's letter on top and rested his hand there for a moment. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were shining with a realization that had taken more than 30 years to arrive. And judging by the expression on his face, he was only beginning to understand how much that delayed truth had cost him. The evening ended quietly. There were no dramatic speeches. No raised voices. No grand declarations. One by one, people gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. The conversations were softer now. More thoughtful. As relatives left the house, several paused to hug me. Others simply squeezed my hand. They did not need to say much. The documents had already said enough. Eventually only Daniel, Ashley, and I remained in the dining room. The plates had been cleared away. The coffee had gone cold. Robert's letter still rested on the table between us. Daniel looked at it for a long time before finally speaking. "I do not know how to fix this," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who would come to me after making a mistake and ask what he should do next. Some things never truly disappear. They simply become harder to see. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You do not fix 30 years in one night," I said gently. "You start by understanding them." He nodded slowly. His eyes, filled with emotion he no longer seemed interested in hiding. "I am sorry," he said. "For everything." I believed him. Not because the words were perfect. Not because they erased what had happened. But because they were honest. And honesty is where healing begins. Ashley remained quiet beside him. The confidence she carried earlier had vanished. She looked smaller somehow. Not defeated. Simply confronted by a reality she had not expected. I felt no desire to embarrass her. No need to punish anyone. Life does that well enough on its own. After a few more minutes, I stood and gathered my things. Daniel immediately rose from his chair. "Let me walk you out." We stepped onto the front porch together. The night air was cool and still. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the glow of streetlights. Before I reached my car, Daniel stopped me. "Mom." I turned. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes. "You were never the burden." The words hung in the air between us. Simple. Quiet. True. I smiled. Not because I had won something. There had never been a competition. Families are not supposed to have winners and losers. They are supposed to have understanding. Sometimes that understanding arrives late. Sometimes painfully late. But when it arrives, it changes everything. I drove home beneath a sky filled with stars. The roads were empty. My thoughts were calm. Back at the house, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar rooms greeted me with their usual silence. Yet the silence felt different now. Lighter somehow. I placed Robert's letter on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment. 30 years earlier, two parents had made a sacrifice out of love. They never asked for recognition. They never demanded gratitude. They simply hoped their son would build a good life. Tonight, the truth had finally completed its journey. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with understanding. And as I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, I realized something important. The greatest gift Robert left behind was not the documents. It was the reminder that truth does not need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it only needs patience. And eventually, if it is real, it finds its way home.